In this video, we're going to talk about consoles, control surfaces, and hybrids. Here's a short video that explains the difference between a console and a control surface. Consoles and control surfaces can look very similar. However, the big difference is that consoles actually process and pass audio signals. The signals enter a console usually at either mic or line level. The console then amplifies, for example, increases the gain from mic to line level, modifies using signal processing like EQ and compression, and then routes the audio signal to the desired location, like workstation inputs, outboard effects processors, or monitor inputs. Some mix engineers prefer to use consoles because of the additional functionality they bring. They'll often route the individual stems from the workstation to the individual inputs on the console, and use the console to sum the signals from multitrack to a stereo or surround mix. Control surfaces don't pass audio, except perhaps if they have mic preamps or a monitor section. They're merely a tactile control surface for the digital audio workstation. Because they don't pass audio or amplify, modify, or route audio signals, control surfaces can be thinner, lighter, and more compact than audio consoles. Also, because they not only control but are controlled by the digital audio workstation, they automatically reconfigure whenever a particular session is opened, which eliminates the setup time spent reconfiguring a console. Recording consoles have not always looked the way they do today. The modern recording console is the brainchild of engineer extraordinaire Tom Dowd. When recording started to be done electronically in the 1920s, recording studios used the same type of mixing consoles as broadcasters. These mixing desks had large bakelite rotary knobs that controlled the volume level, and not many other features. Back then, records were mixed live to disc, and the large knobs made it difficult to adjust more than one or two channels at any one time, making the engineer's job that much harder. So, in about 1960, recording engineer extraordinaire Tom Dowd, whose discography includes just about every artist that ever made a record, thought that recording consoles should have linear sliding faders instead of big knobs, so that the engineer could control up to 10 faders at once. He also added signal processing like EQ and routing. Dowd designed all of these features into a console that he built for Atlantic Records, and mixing consoles ever since, both actual and virtual, have had those features and that look. European consoles differ in design from the American consoles in two ways. One, they're more ergonomic, meaning that they're raked a little bit steeper so that the engineer doesn't have to slump over the console quite as much. My wife used to say she could always tell when a bunch of engineers got together because they were always kind of bent over from reaching over a long console. The downside of having a console raked like this is that it kind of obstructs your view, so you almost have to have the window to the left or the right as opposed to straight in front of you there because you really can't see over the console. The other big difference with the European-style console is that the monitoring section, the returns from the tape machine in those days, was actually not in line with the inputs as it is on most American consoles. It's actually to the right. Those white knobs you see there, that's the monitor section of the console. So the monitor side of the console where you were setting up a mix for the control room or the people in the studio would be done using those faders. Here's the console from the RCA Victor Nashville Studio B, where they actually recorded Elvis and a bunch of other people using that particular console. And here's an even earlier Nashville console. It's all metal. In fact, the console at the Abbey Road studio in England where they recorded the Beatles looks similar in that it's a big metal desk. And here's a console, kind of a pre-Tom Dowd console with rotary knobs. I've actually worked on consoles like that had nothing but knobs, and it was difficult. And this is a Trident mixing console. I had one very similar to this in my room for many years. It's a European design, but it's not raked that steeply, so you can see over it fairly well. But it does have the separate monitoring section to the right, and those are those white knobs that you see there. There were two rows of knobs, 1 through 12, and then 13 through 24 for the 24-track tape returns. The thing to the far right is the patch bay, and that's where you connected the console ins and outs to all of the gear that you wanted to interface. Whenever there are multiple pieces of equipment with a variety of possible connections, a patch bay makes these connections a lot easier to manage. Some of the first patch bays were used by the telephone company to connect calls when switchboard operators did this manually. Today, most audio patch bays still either use telephone connectors, also known as quarter-inch, phone, TS, or TRS, or they use TT connectors. TT actually stands for tiny telephone. The advantage of the TT bays is that there can be twice as many patch points in a single bay. If every piece of equipment has the inputs and outputs connected to a patch bay, whenever anyone needs to interface the gear, they can simply insert a patch cord into the bay. This is far easier than crawling around the back of racks to make the connections. Today, with digital audio workstations, patch bays and patch cords have been replaced by internal buses. Buses route the audio signals to various places, just as patch cords and patch bays do. However, when connecting external gear to digital audio workstations like mic preamps, limiters, and speakers, even today, patch bays can still be very useful. And this was actually my room with the Trident console. This is a picture of Studio A at my studio. This was the larger music room. We had a Sony 636. It was a 36-input Sony MCI console with automation. At one time, when we were kind of transitioning to workstations, we actually had a control surface that rode on rails on top of the console. We weren't using the console as much in those days. We were using external preamps and doing most of the mixing inside of the workstation. But if we needed to, we could move the control surfaces on those rails so we could get to the console underneath. So if you ever go to a mixing stage where they're mixing a movie or a television show, you'll see a console like this, which looks like the stretch limo version of a console. It's actually 3 consoles in one. There's a dialogue section, a music section, and an effects section. And often during a mix, there may be 6 people, 2 mixers for each section of the console, plus a master mixer making 7. As they've moved from magnetic film to workstations now, often they'll use 3 separate control surfaces, one for dialogue, one for music, and one for effects. So each of those 3 mixing units can work more independently. Consoles do 3 things. They amplify, they modify, and they route the signal. Consoles take microphones, which are minus 65 to minus 85 dB. They amplify the mic level signal to line level, plus 4 dB. EQ can be added if necessary, and then they're routed to either the tape recorder or the DAW or wherever. And then the signals return back to the console for monitoring and remixing. And there you can set up a headphone mix for the musicians in the studio. And you can also route signal to any outboard gear you want. In the old days, we used to have external reverbs and other processing. Then the final mix is output to either, in this case today, it would be a file, but at one time it was either tape or a DAT or a CD. Physical consoles can also be classified by the number of ins and number of outs they have. For example, the console that we had, the 636, was actually 36 inputs and 24 outputs. So it would be a 36 by 24. And here's a short video about that. As with digital I/O interfaces, analog mixing consoles have a fixed number of inputs and outputs. For example, a mixing console with 16 inputs and 4 outputs would be designated as a 16 by 4 mixer. In addition to channel outputs, consoles may have other outputs, such as direct outs, aux, and bus sends that can be used for cue mixes, effect sends, and other routing. But these aren't included in the output number. Only the channel outputs are counted. Consoles often have additional inputs as well, such as tape and effects returns, but these inputs aren't included either. Here's a quick way to determine a console's I/O designation. As you look at a mixing console, count the number of channel faders. That's almost always the input number. Then count the number of channel output meters. That's generally the output number. So the inputs are all the mic and line inputs, and the outputs are the channel outputs. So here's one of the consoles they had at Stax in Memphis, and you can see the glowing buttons there, 1 through 8, because they had an 8-track machine. So if you wanted to send something to track 1, you'd push button 1, and the output of that track would go to track 1 on the tape recorder. You could do the same thing with Audition, but it would be on the channel input side. For example, if you had an interface with 8 inputs, you could route input 1 from the interface to a particular track, and input 2 to another track, and input 3, etc. And just like Audition, consoles have busing. Most analog mixing consoles have auxiliary or aux sends, so that a portion of the signal can be sent to outboard gear like reverbs or to create an independent mix to be sent to monitors, headphones, and other places. Digital consoles and workstations use buses to do the same thing. Buses are a way to route the signal to various places and also create additional mixes that differ from the main mix. Early versions of workstation software had a smaller number of available buses, but the number has increased dramatically as computers have gotten faster. Think of a bus as a patch cord that connects 2 devices. Or instead, think of a bus as a bus. Signal gets on the bus at point A and travels to point B where it gets off. The number of buses isn't included in the number of ins and outs, but it does increase the flexibility of the console quite a bit. Consoles could have, for example, 4 aux sends. In Audition, you have 16 sends, and it just allows you to route signal different places much more easily. But like most people, me included, if you're using Audition on your host computer, you have 2 inputs and 2 outputs. So you have a 2 by 2 mixer. And speaking of interfaces, this is the interface that we used to use when I taught this class. Every computer had an interface box with a headphone output. This is the Pro Tools or Avid M-Box Mini. It actually has 2 inputs and 2 outputs. There's only one mic preamp. Well, you see only one XLR, but it does have 2 inputs, one mic and one line level input. And this is what I use in my home studio. It's a Focusrite interface box. Prior to that, I had a Tascam 6 input device, but that stopped being supported when I upgraded my operating system. So now it just kind of sits there taking up space. So control surfaces don't amplify, modify, or route signal. In fact, they often don't even pass audio except if they have a monitor section. This was the Mackie Huey, and actually it did have a couple of preamps built in, so it did pass audio in that respect. And then, of course, it had a monitor section that you could route a bunch of things through, which is kind of cool. And I used one of these at the studio for a number of years. And this looks like a console, but that's actually a control surface. And you can tell it's not a console because it's super, super thin. Consoles can't physically be that thin because they have circuit boards that have to go vertically because the faders are so closely spaced. Here's a little desktop control surface that's not actually that much bigger than a computer keyboard. Currently in Studio A of my old studio, they had the Avid C24, which is basically like the Mackie. Instead of having only 8, though, there are 24 faders. And by the way, you can have a session with 100 tracks, and you can select which tracks you want to see. You can only see 24 tracks physically at a time, but you can bank through, or you can select which tracks you want to show up on this control surface. What I like about the C24 versus, say, the Focusrite Control 24, which is very similar, is that this is much quieter. On the Control 24, when you actually open a session, you'd hear this big whoosh, and the faders all came up. And you can actually hear the faders moving, which I thought was distracting. You don't hear that with the C24. And it has all the advantages of a control surface. You have the digital scribble strip, the motorized faders, the shaft encoders for the panning and the aux sends. You have the cut, copy, save, undo buttons. You have monitor knobs and transport buttons. So it really does make it easy. If you really want a tactile surface to actually touch things rather than having to use your computer keyboard, you can do most of it with this control surface. You still need a keyboard to name tracks and whatever. You can't do it with this, but other than that, you can do everything else with the control surface. They call this Vegas mode on the control surface. It's a way to test and make sure that all of the functionality works. So you hit a certain sequence of keys and this happens. This was the Pro Tools Icon, which was their largest control surface. And these could be very expensive depending on how many faders you got. I think they started out at about $40,000 and you could spend well over $100,000 for one of these. Unfortunately, they've stopped supporting them, which is what a lot of companies do that specialize more in hardware like Pro Tools. There were a couple of studios in town that actually had these. This was Red Echo Post. They've since closed down. Also, Sonic Arts had 2 of these, and they've also closed too. So in addition to consoles and control surfaces, you also have hybrids. And here's a short video that explains what a hybrid is. Consoles amplify, modify, and route audio. Typically, they take a signal from mic level to line level, modified with signal processing either from the console itself or from outboard gear, and then route the audio to the desired destination or combine the signals to create a mix. Control surfaces may look like consoles, but they typically don't amplify, modify, or route audio. When used in conjunction with a digital audio workstation, they simply emulate the functions of an audio console and allow the operator to vary several parameters at once. Hybrid consoles handle audio just as conventional consoles do. However, they have a control surface interface. Some of the earliest hybrids were made by Euphonics around 1988. These had a sleek control surface with all the faders and knobs of a typical console, but they were only a couple of inches deep. All of the audio was processed in a separate rack connected to the control surface by a single multi-pair control cable and an RS-232 for the computer. Today, hybrids are popular for sound reinforcement. Many of these have iPads or other portable control surfaces that are connected to the audio processors via Wi-Fi. The operators can then walk anywhere in the venue, evaluate the sound, and make audio adjustments from those positions. And even though you may not have seen in person any of the big hybrid consoles, you may have seen something like this. It's a mixer with an iPad interface. So the iPad just slides in and can dock with it, but you can also pull the iPad out and walk around the venue and actually tweak things remotely as long as you have a Wi-Fi connection. And you have all the functionality of a console with that. Again, you can add EQ, you can add processing like gating and compression, you can add reverb and echo. And it makes it very nice. If you're doing live sound at a venue, you're not really stuck at the mixer position. You can actually get up and walk around and check out different things. Okay, so that ends the video on consoles and control surfaces. Thanks.